Welcome to the Kapital News. I am your host, Alex Karitis. Today is Tuesday, March 30th, 2021. Thank you so much for joining me. Title of today's podcast, Milgram Experiment in Global Authority. I've been mentioning this psychological study that was conducted back in the 1960s over the course of the past couple of weeks, if not few weeks, and said I would be getting to it. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of this experiment. Some of you may have heard of it. And some of you may never have heard of it, and that's perfectly fine. Now you are going to hear about it, and you're going to get a description as to what it is and why I have been mentioning it over the past few weeks. And of course, this, to me, is in direct relation to the pandemic, COVID-19, and how governments around the globe have been behaving and responding in the policies that they have been putting forward. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that the whole purpose right out of the gate with this pandemic was so that the powers could conduct this type of global Milgram experiment. But as the saying goes, never let a crisis go to waste, right? And of course, the government is an institution of force. The government is an institution of authority. And that's exactly what the Milgram experiment is all about. It's about obedience. It's about seeing how people respond to authority figures. So when they tell you to stay home, when they tell you to wear a mask, when they tell you to wash your hands umpteen times a day, when they tell you not to hug somebody, not to shake somebody's hand, when they tell you not to sit or stand next to somebody, or if you're going to, you have to be 6 feet away, when they tell you you cannot go to work, you cannot open up your small business, your livelihood, things that you've poured your blood, sweat, and tears into. You can't go see them. You can't go touch them. You can't go to business. You can't do anything. You have to do what we tell you to do. Now, you can say, out of the gate with this thing, there were a lot of unknowns. Well, we are a year into it. And now we have quite a bit of data. We know who is getting sick. We know who is dying. We know the survival rate of this thing is like almost 99.9%. Yet we still have these outrageous restrictions and lockdowns that are gutting the entire economy. You know, we talk here on a weekly basis about the initial jobless claims. It was 684,000 last week. Obviously on this Thursday, we'll get that updated report. And this Friday, being the first Friday of the month, which will obviously be April, will give us the March jobs report. So we'll see what happens there. And later in the podcast, we might get into some market performance and some other things. But even the markets can respond to this type of experiment, right? Because what is plastered all over the news? Experts, experts, experts. Let's talk to a millionaire investor. Let's talk to a billionaire investor. Let's talk to a hedge fund manager. Let's talk to a major bond fund manager. Let's talk to a private equity director, etc., etc. And what do most of these people come on and say? Oh, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Buy, buy, buy. Buy, buy, buy. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. We're the expert. Keep buying. Even though they have a vested interest to having you continue to pour money into the market, because that's how they make their livelihood. That's how they make their living. So we'll get to that. So let's just get right started on this. And you can simply find this. I mean, a simple Google search will bring this up. I'm actually just reading this off the Wikipedia page because this is a very well-documented experiment. It has been replicated. And of course, like any type of experiment, there's going to be people who question the validity of it or, you know, how sound it is. But nonetheless, I found this interesting when I learned about this in college. It's stuck with me. And then just witnessing what we have been observing over the past year with these lockdowns and how they just seemingly continue to make stuff up. But if it is a health official, if it is a politician, if it is somebody from the federal government or a state government administration, or from a health authority, people fall in line. And that's exactly what this is all about. So here's the Milgram experiment. I hope you find it interesting, and I hope you can connect the dots to what I'm saying. And of course, if you disagree with me, write to me and say why. So the Milgram experiment on obedience to authority figures was a series of social psychological experiments conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram. They measured the willingness of study participants, men from a diverse range of occupations with varying levels of education, to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. Very important. Participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a quote-unquote learner. These fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. Let me repeat that. These fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. Now, unfortunately, in this case, with what we're experiencing in the pandemic, these shocks are real. They are putting people out of business permanently. The experiment found unexpectedly that a very high proportion of subjects would fully obey the instructions, albeit reluctantly. Milgram first described in his research in a 1963 article in the Journal of Abnormal in Social Psychology, and later discussed his findings in greater depth in his 1974 book, Obedience to Authority, An Experimental View. The experiments began in July of 1961 in the basement of Lindsley Chittenden Hall at Yale University, 3 months after the start of the trial of German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised his psychological study to explain the psychology of genocide and answer the popular contemporary question: could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? The experiment was repeated many times around the globe with fairly consistent results. So here is now the procedure of the experiment. 3 individuals took part in each session of the experiment: the experimenter, who was in charge of the session; the teacher, a volunteer for a single session. The teachers were led to believe that they were merely assisting, whereas they were actually the subjects of the experiment. The learner, an actor and a confederate of the experimenter, who pretended to be a volunteer. Okay, so understand this. You have somebody who is completely clueless that they are actually the subject of this experiment, and you have another person who's participating who is an actor in this experiment, and of course, they know that they are acting. The subject and the actor arrived at the session together. The experimenter told them that they were taking part in a scientific study of memory and learning to see what the effect of punishment is on a subject's ability to memorize content. Also, he always clarified that the payment for their participation in the experiment was secured regardless of its development. The subject and actor drew slips of paper to determine their rules. Unknown to the subject, both slips said teacher. The actor would always claim to have drawn the slip that read learner, thus guaranteeing that the subject would always be the teacher. Next, the teacher and learner were taken into an adjacent room where the learner was strapped into what appeared to be an electric chair. The experimenter, dressed in a lab coat in order to appear to have more authority, told the participants this was to ensure that the learner would not escape. So you put somebody in a lab coat. What type of effect does that have on somebody's psychology? Very interesting, isn't it? In a later variation of the experiment, the Confederate would eventually plead for mercy and yell that he had a heart condition. At some point prior to the actual test, the teacher was given a sample electric shock from the electroshock generator in order to experience firsthand what the shock that the learner would supposedly receive during the experiment would feel like. The teacher and learner were then separated so that they could communicate but not see each other. The teacher was then given a list of word pairs that he was to teach the learner. The teacher began by reading the list of word pairs to the learner. The teacher would then read the first word of each pair and read 4 possible answers. The learner would press a button to indicate his response. If the answer was incorrect, the teacher would administer a shock to the learner, with the voltage increasing in 15-volt increments for each wrong answer. If correct, the teacher would read the next word pair. The volts ranged from 15 to 450. The shock generator included verbal markings that vary from slight shock to danger, severe shock, and of course, if you went to the extreme, you would have killed this person if you had actually given them real electric shocks. The subjects believed that for each wrong answer, the learner was receiving actual shocks. In reality, there were no shocks. After the learner was separated from the teacher, the learner set up a tape recorder integrated with the electroshock generator, which played pre-recorded sounds for each shock level. As the voltage of the fake shocks increased, the learner began making audible protests, such as banging repeatedly on the wall that separated him from the teacher. In every condition, the learner makes or says a predetermined sound or word. When the highest voltages were reached, the learner fell silent. If at any time the teacher indicated a desire to halt the experimenter was instructed to give specific verbal prods. And remember, the experimenter is in a white lab coat. The prods were in this order. Number 1, please continue or please go on. Number 2, the experiment requires that you continue. Number 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Number 4, you have no other choice. You must go on. Now, just listen to those prods when somebody actually tries to say, you know what, can we halt this experiment? Can we perhaps stop this experiment? I think the guy in the other room is really suffering here. No, again, please continue or please go on. If that doesn't do it, they then say the experiment requires that you continue. If that doesn't work, it is absolutely essential, that you continue. And if that doesn't work, you have no other choice. You must go on. Okay? Now, listen to that language and what we are told on a near daily basis from all of these quote-unquote health experts and politicians and bureaucrats. A little bit of a similarity, isn't it? Prod number 2 could only be used if prod number 1 was unsuccessful. If the subject still wished to stop after all 4 successive verbal prods, the experiment was halted. Otherwise, the experiment was halted after the subject had elicited the maximum 450-volt shock 3 times in succession. Again, if these were real shocks, they would have killed the person. The experimenter also had prods to use if the teacher made specific comments. If the teacher asked whether the learner might suffer permanent physical harm, the experimenter replied, quote, although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on. Well, I guess it wouldn't be damaged because he would have been dead. If the teacher said that the learner clearly wants to stop, the experimenter replied, quote, whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly, so please go on. Now on to some of the predictions that were made prior to the experiment. Before conducting the experiment, Milgram polled 14 Yale University senior year psychology majors to predict the behavior of 100 hypothetical teachers. All of the poll respondents believed that only a very small fraction of teachers, the range was from 0 to 3 out of 100, with an average of 1.2, would be prepared to inflict the maximum voltage. Milgram also informally polled his colleagues and found that they too believed very few subjects would progress beyond a very strong shock. He also reached out to honorary Harvard University graduate Chaim Homnick, who noted that this experiment would not be concrete evidence of the Nazis' innocence due to the fact that, quote, poor people are more likely to cooperate. Okay, so always looking down on the poor people, unfortunately. Milgram also polled 40 psychiatrists from a medical school, and they believed that by the 10th shock, when the victim demands to be free, most subjects would stop the experiment. They predicted that by the 300-volt shock, when the victim refuses to answer, only 3.73% of the subjects would still continue. And they believed that only a little over 0.1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. So all of these students, all of these actual psychiatrists, they all thought that the subjects here, they would have stopped. Their humanity would have kicked in, sympathy, empathy, it would have kicked in, and just because there's an experimenter standing in the room with a white lab jacket wouldn't mean anything. They would have stopped it. Okay? Milgram, however, suspected before the experiment that the obedience exhibited by Nazis reflected a distinct German character and planned to use the American participants as a control group before using German participants, expected to behave closer to the Nazis. However, the unexpected results stopped him from conducting the same experiment on German participants. So before the experiment, even Dr. Milgram believed that, well, this might just be something that has to do with nationality, until the results came in. Here are the results. In Milgram's first set of experiments, 65%, 26 out of 40, of experiment participants administered the experiment's final massive 400-volt shock. Again, it would have killed somebody. In all administered shocks of at least 300 volts. All of them administered shocks of at least 300 volts. Subjects were uncomfortable doing so and displayed varying degrees of tension and stress. These signs included sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, and digging their fingernails into their skin, and some were even having nervous laughing fits or seizures. 14 of the 40 subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughing or smiling. Every participant paused the experiment at least once to question it. Most continued after being assured by the experimenter, again, the person in the lab jacket. Most continued after being assured by the experimenter. Some said they would refund the money they were paid for participating. They felt so bad. Milgram summarized the experiment in his 1974 article, The Perils of Obedience, writing the following. The legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are of enormous importance, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ear ringing with the screams of the victims. Authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. Ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. Isn't that amazing? Human psychology. Oh, it's unbelievable. Continuing. Later, Milgram and other psychologists performed variations of the experiment throughout the world with similar results. Milgram later investigated the effect of the experiment's locale on obedience levels by holding an experiment in an unregistered backstreet office in a bustling city as opposed to at Yale, a respectable university. The level of obedience, although somewhat reduced, was not significantly lower. What made more of a difference was the proximity of the learner and the experimenter. There were also variations tested involving groups. Thomas Blass of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County performed a meta-analysis on the results of repeated performances of the experiment. He found that while the percentage of participants who are prepared to inflict fatal voltages ranged from 28% to 91%, that's a big range, again, 28 to 91%, there was no significant trend over time and the average percentage for U.S. adults at 61% was close to the one for non-U.S. studies, 66%. I'd like to know who it was that went all the way up to 91%. And then the participants who refused to administer the final shocks neither insisted that the experiment be terminated, nor left the room to check the health of the victim without requesting permission to leave, as per Milgram's notes and recollections when fellow psychologist Philip Zimbardo asked him about that point. Milgram later created a documentary film titled Obedience, showing the experiment and its results. He also produced a series of 5 social psychology films, some of which dealt with his experiments. So there you have it. There's, of course, more to this that you can find here on Wikipedia. You can find it, I'm sure, in other psychology books. But nonetheless, this was something that I wanted to make the audience aware of, because that's exactly what I believe we are living through right now. It is simply, who are the quote-unquote experts being blasted across the airwaves into our ears, into our eyes, the images on CNN, MSNBC, and so many other news outlets, almost nonstop 24/7, depending on the news network. And you have the people breaking down, biting their lips, digging into their skin because of what's going on, even though they are complying. It's very much akin to what could be said right now with a lot of people who are stuck at home, who are suffering from mental problems, mental health issues, because they're not able to go about their normal routines. They're not able to socialize. They're not able to interact with their friends, their family, their loved ones, their colleagues. They may not feel productive. And so they are breaking down mentally, just like these test subjects broke down. But hey, at the end of the day, all they were doing was following orders, from an authority figure, from somebody who wears a white lab coat, from somebody who has doctor before his or her name, or PhD after their name, or is a professor at one major university after the next. You see how simple it is to get in line? You see why it's important? You have to draw the parallels. You have to make the connections with why small government is so important, and why small government and individual liberty is unfortunately the rarity when it comes to human history, and not the rule. It's evidently too easy to control people, which is quite scary. And we are witnessing that right now. And you have that famous quote, and I can't remember who it's attributed to, unfortunately, off the top of my head, but I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me. But it basically goes, those who can convince you of falsehoods can make you sorry, folks. Sorry for the pause. A little technical difficulty there. Excuse me for that. Can make you commit atrocities. Okay, so those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And that's pretty much the sum of it at the end of the day. That's what it comes down to. And people are getting in line, following these orders, depending on what city you might be in. Wasn't it Mayor de Blasio up in New York City who even told his constituents that if you see somebody who isn't following the rules, to turn them in? How ridiculous is that? If you see somebody who has opened up their business when they shouldn't have, call the police on them. If you see somebody who is not wearing a mask when they should be wearing a mask, call the police on them. How ridiculous. And there are stories that people did. They snitched on their neighbors. How ridiculous are we as people at the end of the day here? And I can only imagine what type of long-term effect this is going to have on people's mental health. The long-term effect that this is going to have on children. Now, people like to say that children are quite resilient, and I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that, but I'm sure that a lot of them are going to end up suffering some negative consequences because of this as well. Not being able to be in school, not being able to interact with their peers, which is extremely important, especially as they're very young. Younger kids need that type of social interaction so they can form those types of behaviors that one needs basically to become successful in the real world. And I'm not talking about amassing material possession. I'm just talking being able to communicate and socialize with other people. So I think this is going to have some real negative impacts and effects. And of course, it's going to take a while to see what transpires. I hope that is not the case. I really do. But I was just watching something on Bloomberg yesterday, and there was a mental health app that you can download, I guess, and private equity is taking quite a big interest in it, and it already put a $3 billion valuation on it. Now, of course, valuations all over the place are completely ridiculous and extreme, but nonetheless, that shows you the extent to which people are seeking out some sort of mental health assistance. They need somebody to talk to work out whatever it is they are going through. And this hits everybody. This hits men, this hits women, this hits children, teenagers, you name it. So what is that going to mean in a larger picture sense? Are people going to be able to cope? Are people going to be able to get back to work? Whatever normal was before, are we ever going to be able to get back to normal? How long is it going to take for that to happen? Because are people going to need more mental health days? I mean, you have mental health days all over the place when it comes to college campuses. You have all these safe zones. I didn't have any safe zone. I didn't have mental health days when I was in college. You have finals week? You have finals week. You got to study. You got to cram. You got to do what you got to do. Get prepared. Oh, no. You can have a mental health day where the university is just, it's all shut down. Stay home. Go in your dorms. Take a walk around the park. Do whatever you want. It's a mental health day. Are we going to have mental health days at work? How much lost productivity is that going to result in? You're going to be paid for your mental health day? You see how this can spiral somewhat out of control? Okay? Because obviously people are going to start demanding, if they aren't already, the ability to work from home. I think we're already seeing some signs of that. Now, it might not mean that they are demanding to work from home 5 days a week, but it'd be nice if I can work from home 2 or 3 days a week. I can spend more time with my kids. I can take care of some other errands and responsibilities that just get too difficult to do by the time I get home from work. And after you get home from work, well, most other places might be closed as well, so you can't run those errands. So it becomes convenient. And so I can do those things during the week as opposed to my weekend when I really just want to relax and enjoy life, friends, family, etc., etc. And a lot of businesses, of course, will acquiesce. They will say that's perfectly fine. We are noticing how productive you are from home, etc., etc., so we don't have a problem with that. But the other thing that some employees might start to call for is mental health days. And there might be some bigger firms out there who can perfectly afford to do this, but they may already have them or something similar to them. But if this is something that gets pushed, or something that the government tries to get involved with, same thing with like the minimum wage, saying, oh no, it doesn't matter what size business you are, you have to offer, as part of your benefits package, you have to offer mental health days. Maybe it'll be a week, 5 days, 10 days, who knows what they'll come up with. But this is just something to be on the lookout for. And I am in no way belittling anybody who has a mental health problem. Okay, some of them, of course, are very, very serious. And others, on the other end, are just people who are weak-minded, Period. End of story. Okay? Life's tough. It is not a safe place out there when you open the front door. Lots of things can happen. Okay? Lots of things can happen. You just got to suck it up a lot of the time. But, those people I will question. Okay? And we know that there are a ton of those people out there, unfortunately. We see them in the media. We see them on the mainstream media. Because they're just concerned about their feelings and that you have to comply with their feelings. If you offend them, it's a crime. If they offend you, it's perfectly fine. It only works one way. It's a one-way street. Those are the weaklings. But there are a lot of other people, unfortunately, that have some serious mental health issues. But circling back to the Milgram experiment here, I hope you understand why I have been mentioning this over the past few weeks. I hope you can draw the same conclusions that I can, that regardless as to how COVID-19 came about, governments the world over said this is a crisis, this is an opportunity, and we are not going to let it go to waste, and we are going to see what we can get away with. And boy, oh boy, are they continuing to get away virtually with murder. They are killing small businesses, mid-sized businesses. They are turning people into zombies. They are negatively impacting people's mental health. But you got to wear your mask. You got to shut down. And now you got to wear 2 masks. And you got to stick with it. You got to stick with it. Everything seems to be okay. I'm done. I want to halt the experiment. Everything seems to be okay. Not too many people are dying. The survival rate is very, very strong. No, but you got to take the vaccine. You got to take the vaccine. You got to take the vaccine. You got to wear a mask. You got to put 2 masks on. You got to stay home. You got to social distance. You got to watch the kids, etc., etc. As soon as you start pushing back, they have an answer for you. You push back against, they got another one, etc., etc., exactly like the Milgram experiment. So check it out for yourself. Milgram. Milgram. Google it, study it, understand it, because that's what we're going through. Stay diversified, stay vigilant, and stay with the Capital News. I am Alex Koritis. Godspeed.